This
I am
conference will
so
now be
excited.
recorded.
I am Lisa Maurice, and I am so excited that you have joined us today for Healing After Harm, which is something that I am thrilled is changing in healthcare. We have put together here some perspectives that represent cutting edge thoughts on how your organization can better serve not just patients and family members who may have experienced some kind of medical error or situation, but also our clinical colleagues. So I am going to ask, first of all, that if you have comments or questions, that you put those in the chat feature in the navigation pane for GoToMeeting. Also, for those of you who are joining us by phone or are on your computer, if you could mute your background. All lines are currently live and we'll hear everything. If you are in an office setting where if you put us on hold, we will hear your hold music. We would prefer that you mute your phone and then put it on hold. Today we're going to go over the objectives of the webinar, which are fairly simple. We'll introduce Mary Ellen Mannix and Marty Hatley, and then we'll have their presentations and questions or comments. So hopefully my slides will advance. Our objectives today are that you'll become familiar with restorative practice and know how you can implement restorative practice in your setting, whether you're in a small environment or a large, and regardless of the type of the event that occurs. And we want to build understanding of candor, communications, and optimal resolution processes, and learn also how that can be implemented in your setting. So we're going to start today with Mary Ellen Mannix, who has experienced a difficult situation with the loss of her son many years ago, but it has led Mary Ellen to advocate for restorative practice, and she currently works in early childhood education in the state of Pennsylvania and is a member of the state of Pennsylvania's Patient Advisory Council. And Mary Ellen has been instrumental in getting laws passed around the country for newborn screening for congenital heart disease, so that other parents don't face the same trials that she faced. Mary Ellen has studied restorative practice to learn how people who face the trials that she has faced can be comforted. Mary Ellen.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you for the kind introduction. And just to, I have to acknowledge that that is the most gentle way I have ever heard anyone describe what has led me to where we are today. My son's tragic death and the definitely significant challenges in its aftermath to find some healing on a personal level, professional level, and as well as a legislative level for those who are coming after. And my service in Pennsylvania includes that as a board member on the Pennsylvania Patient Safety Authority. I just wanted to make sure people understood. I think that's what you were referencing in the introduction. So I would like to take a minute before I discuss this slide to highlight that as the parent of a child who died from multiple medical errors to treat a condition he was born with, in these discussions, I think it is helpful and important to highlight that in our law journey afterwards, All of the physicians and healthcare clinicians who were part of it all testified that James did not die from anything that he was born with. And I don't highlight this for a personal reason. I highlight this for all of the patients and children and others who are coming into the healthcare system because they need help, simply because we are presenting to you, to the healthcare system, with a condition that is less than, air quotes here, perfect, does not mean that then, well, of course, then he would die. And I think it's very important that we all remember that. And unfortunately, in certainly the 2001 timeframe when my son was here and was receiving care, that was something that wasn't necessarily 100% accepted. So I'd like to advocate for the kids who are coming into the system now. They're there to receive the best healing that you may be able to offer, and if you can't, that you help them find what might be better or help them make the decisions on what happens next, because we all know we don't all always get the result we all want. And that's why we're here to have this discussion today. So recently someone described my experience after having lost my son and not looking for legal help, yet finding one, as somewhat serendipitous. And it was. Without that connection that I ironically really didn't look for, I never would have had the opportunity to understand what happened to my son, let alone have the option to decide how we're going to carry his memory and if we will be able to share what happened to him. So I would use that same phrasing when explaining how I came upon this thing called restorative practices. It was absolutely serendipitous. If after we finished our law experience, which I like to also clarify, I don't really advocate anybody do. However, there is a place for all of us and all aspects of health and law in this discussion. I don't think the lawsuit is the first way to go, and restorative practices can really help you find another option. So after having exhausted and having made the personal decision that there is nothing, there will be no more legal pursuit, I, on my own, sought out conversations with the clinicians involved in my son's care. And yes, that means I was seeking post-trial personal conversations with physicians I had sued. And what absolutely was their right, many refused, many answered with legal letters. However, one answered personally, and we were able to sit down one-on-one and have a conversation. From that conversation came hope that this can happen for others and not just for me, and not just for that physician who himself had his own set of challenges surrounding what happens after a medical error. And I am eternally grateful for him allowing me to see a little bit into that window. I've always been an early childhood educator and a mom, someone who really never intersected deeply with the healthcare system prior to what happened to my son. I wouldn't know, I wouldn't understand the language, let alone the experience or the feelings of healthcare clinicians who have to face those challenges of you tried to do something and it didn't work the way you wanted it to, with such a heavy weight of somebody's life. There is something that you'll find in restorative practices called a Johari window. That's Johari. So basically, the Johari window, and I apologize, this is not on my slides, but you can Google it and find it. The Johari window is basically a window with 4 squares in it. It's a square broken into four equal quadrants. And when you think about yourself, you think of there's four perspectives. In one of those windows, it's how you see things. And if you envision a blind on each one of these four quadrants, that quadrant, how you see things, that blind is all the way up. You know exactly how you see things. Next to it is the blind of how other people see things. And we don't know how other people see things, so that one is all the way down. There's two other windows I'll just briefly mention for conciseness, but one is how we think people see things, and that might be a little bit open, and the other one is how people tell us they see things, and that one is open a little bit wider. But that other one where how others see things or see us, we have no idea. So in that realm, I have no idea. I had no idea about a clinician's experience. So again, I'm grateful for those clinicians, those who are joining us today, those who are working on this issue in healthcare, for their courage and their willingness to take care of themselves, to take care of their heart so they can share it with us, and we can help them make it better for everybody. So on this slide that is up right now, what is restorative practices? Often when I tell people I have a master's degree in education and restorative practices, they think I'm an educator and a dental hygienist. And I understand that now. However, restorative practices is a social science that studies how to improve and repair relationships between people and communities. This conflict resolution or peace-building approach has its roots in indigenous cultures in our friends' country in Australia with the Aborigines, as well as in New Zealand with the Maori. And some of their practices include that idea that we work together when something happens in our communities, whatever that community is, and there's a harm that happens, because this happened. It's been happening for eons. Sometimes, as much as we want to stay connected and we want to understand, there's almost a natural push and pull that we recalibrate into a little bit of conflict. It, in a lot of ways, is where our growth lies. So the Maori had created some approaches and restorative practices that, and we can go to the next slide, really helps us acknowledge the things that we may want to do and keep present to help reduce conflict, as well as repair harm when something has happened. So what is restorative? There are these three elements that you see on the slide there, that it's voluntary, that this is a process, that everyone who is engaging in the process has agreed to do voluntarily, that those who are voluntarily participating in this are going to acknowledge the harm that happened, that there's not going to be, well, I see the harm as this, even though you see it as something else, that you're going to acknowledge the harm on how that other party or place is seeing it or needing addressed, and that it's inclusive, that you're giving the opportunity that everyone who in any way was impacted by the harm, that they have an opportunity to be part of this process and deciding or figuring out what may or may not be able to be done to help restore what didn't happen the way you wanted it to. So to give you a little bit of history on where this comes from in current times, there's a public officer named Terry O'Connell from Australia, who created something that's now called the Real Justice Restorative Conference Model in the early 90s. And I apologize, I'm not going to have the exact dates, but again, this is available if you'd like links or additional information. I'd be happy to give it to you. You can probably find it based on the names I'm giving. But so Terry O'Connell worked with a family in the early 90s of a a young man who was killed in a robbery. So again, this is not in the healthcare realm. So I'm taking what is done in the public realm and bringing it and seeing how we can make it work in the healthcare realm. But I think it's important that you're aware of Michael Marslew. And after his death, this police officer could see that there was a lot of pain in the community, and he wanted to bring people together. So he reached out to one of the people who was involved in the killing. He reached out to the family and friends of the person who was killed, and they were able to come together and sit down and have a conversation. Now, if that's not terrifying, I don't know what is. So the convict, and this gentleman was, he did have to do time, but they brought him together, and they did not do this until after Terry O'Connell had conversations privately with the family, with the friends, and with the family of the gentleman who was a part of what happened. He didn't actually do the killing, but he was a part of the crowd where things kind of went wrong. And that facilitation piece is incredibly important, because everyone, and when you think about healthcare, when something happens that you didn't intend, it has an emotional impact on everyone involved, and everyone involved needs and deserves to have somebody advocating for their needs in their corner. And it most likely, after an unintended healthcare harm, it most likely is not going to be the patient's family that's going to be supporting a clinician that was involved in it. Even if in time they may be able to, initially you need somebody there as an advocate, and not only someone who is there to protect a third party, but who is really there to listen and find out what this clinician is going to need to be able to heal from this. Whether or not that is engaging voluntarily in an inclusive restorative conference may or may not be, and it may or may not look different than how you handle one for another set of people who have been involved in a harm. So on the other side of the slide, you see informal to formal. So this is an example of how restorative practices includes a set of processes to help us find that point of healing, that point of how we can continue to move on. It can go from a very informal, almost impromptu discussion to a very formal conference. And what I just tried to describe, and I apologize, it was a bit jumpy, but what I just described was a very formal, very intentional practice. And in another element, when I described earlier my conversation with one of the physicians post-trial, that was very informal. There was not preparation for that outside of some initial emails back and forth. However, I will highlight that for both that physician and myself, there were clearly a series of things that we need to do on our own to take care of ourselves, to be able to get to the point where we could sit in a respectful manner and be curious and listen to the other to find out, okay, is there anything that we can do to support the other in healing after this harm? Next slide, please. So I offer you the compass of shame. There's that big, I like to call it the 5-letter, 4-letter word in healthcare, especially post-adverse event. I am the first one to tell you, this is not about finger wagging. We need to acknowledge the presence of this human affect that we all carry. Regardless of the training and the professional expectations that you have in your job, you will carry this emotional feeling, this affect. I do have the citations there from the psychologists that originally created this compass of shame. And I think it's important to look at, these are the identified and evidence-based ways of how humans manage their shame. When you think of the affects, so based on Nathanson and Tomlinson, and there's a pendulum of affects that we all carry from birth as humans. We just come with these. And if you think the most sought after one, the highest one on the line would be like ecstasy and joy. And then if you slide all the way down through all the different, like, you know, maybe, a pleasure of eating something and, oh, that tastes so good, or feeling the nice weather, and you're starting to slide down. And at the very bottom is something called dis-smell. So if you think about when something smells really bad and your nose starts to crinkle up, think about when you watch something or you hear someone say something that you are just disgusted by. Your face sometimes will do that as well. You are experiencing the human affect of dis-smell. In the middle of that slide, right smack dab in the middle, is shame. As an early childhood educator and as a mother of 5 and now proud grandmother of 1, I can tell you I've seen the infants who you think, why do you feel bad that you just threw that cup to the side? Their eyes go down, their heads look down, their eyes go over to one side, they're afraid to look at you, they feel bad. And you have never yelled at them, you've never been upset, and yet innately, this little human who is starting to make all those different neuron connections feels shame. So I think this is one of the elephants in the room that we need to acknowledge and be aware of. Next slide, please. So you want to be aware that, especially when we're talking about conflict. So this is a quote from an old publication, but I find that it is incredibly relevant in this conversation, that conflict is an energy that is there. It is going to remain, and we kind of create it, and we need to do something with it. And depending upon how we manage our shame is going to be very closely related to what happens to that conflict. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned at the beginning, what is restorative? It is voluntary and it is inclusive. So in this window, this is not your Johari window, this is the social discipline window. You'll see on the 2 axes, on one axis is how much support you're offering someone, and on the other, the vertical, is how much control you are exerting in a situation. Where we all want to get to in healthcare is that width, that red block where we're offering a lot of support, and we're offering it in, we're offering a lot of control, but we're not giving too much control, and we're not giving crazy amount, so that you can be there for them. You want it controlled and supportive. Next slide, please. So what I'm offering you today as a tool are restorative questions. This, again, is something that you can Google and you will find the restorative justice questions. I have adapted these slightly for use in healthcare settings. I also have adapted them for use with early childhood professionals, and they've been very helpful in both settings, quite frankly. So the idea here is, in the first block of questions under addressing challenging behaviors, this is your script. You can alter it a little bit as you have a conversation, but under the addressing challenging behavior questions, these are the questions that you would ask someone who has been involved in causing a harm, inadvertently or not. These are the most helpful questions that have been shown to allow an individual to answer without being defensive. The second set of questions is responding to harm. Those are for those individuals who have been directly harmed or impacted by that harm. So you can tell in my language, depending upon the group that you are with in healthcare at a certain time, you may or may not flip these depending upon the hat. So for example, when I'm with a group of clinicians who are trying to manage their feelings and their experiences now that either someone has been sued or there's been an adverse event, we might start with responding to harm. But if you are in a situation where you are trying to help a healthcare clinician see or understand if they see the harm they caused, you're going to start with addressing challenging behaviors. Now, thirdly, I'll offer, and then I'm going to try to wrap this up quick because Marty's got a lot of good stuff. The third thing I will offer is that the goal is to have in restorative practice, and a restorative practice can be a process like just culture. It can be a process like candor that we're going to hear about next. The goal is to have, again, we go back to the beginning, all inclusive. Everyone who is in the community that is impacted by the harm is a part of the conversation, that they're voluntarily there, and you're going to ask them these questions. So if we were to have myself and a physician a part of this kind of conversation as the patient, I would want a facilitator to ask the healthcare representative what happened, and for me to hear them say what happened will immediately de-escalate my passions and my potential anger, because by them answering before I've said anything, they are acknowledging the harm. They are acknowledging that we're all on the same wavelength. And how are you going to get that and make sure you're going to have those independent facilitator conversations prior to bringing these two groups together? So this is a tool that you can also use if you are, while I get to say that, we had a trial, I would not at all count ours as something that healed everybody or anybody. And there was a lot that I still had to manage. And I know a lot of patients and families are out there that they never even get to talk to a lawyer at length. They don't get any representation, or they do not feel that there's been any restoration of the harm. You can use these questions independently for yourself with your family. While when you answer, what do you think needs to happen to foster healing? You can answer, shoot for the moon, what you would really want. But then you're going to think, okay, so maybe that's not going to happen. What else could happen? What else could help foster healing? And then you're on your way. Sometimes we really do need to take care of ourselves independently to be able to heal and move forward. So my final thought is really in terms of all of these new, and it's great to see them, approaches and eager attempts to heal harm after an event in healthcare. It's not only that you are just implementing it, it's how you do it. So I would encourage implementing any process with a really restorative practice lens. Include everyone. Make sure you're doing it with people. Thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much, Mary Ellen. I learned so much in your presentation, and I've made notes to look up the Johari window and the restorative justice model. And I really appreciate the concept of what do you think needs to happen to foster healing, because once you identify that, then you're right. You are on your way. Thank you so much. So now we're going to turn to Marty Hatley, who is the president and CEO of Project Patient Care. I've heard Marty introduced before as a recovering attorney, and he does have a background in civil rights and medical liability defense work. He is currently working to advocate for patient safety and serves on a number of boards, including the Consumers Advancing Patient Safety Board. I am so fortunate to have Marty as a colleague and a mentor and appreciate the work that he is putting in across the country on introducing people to candor. Marty?
Thanks, Lisa. Marianne, I just have to say, too, that I feel like I just found a treasure chest. I had a little familiarity with some of the concepts of restorative justice, but I don't think I don't think I've ever walked through it or had somebody walk me through it. And it was just a fantastic presentation full of great tools. So thank you. And I also kind of feel like the blindfolded person feeling the same elephant, but describing it in different terms, because so I'm somewhere in that Kohari thing of thinking about, okay, how do other people see this thing that I see? Okay,
well,
oh, you're welcome. Thank you. I mean, honestly, it was just fantastic. So, by the way, my background in defense litigation is years and years ago. I mean, early 80s. And I do feel like I'm kind of working off some of the karma that bad karma I generated then by the role I played for a couple of years in defending cases that involved intimidating patients and families and other witnesses on the plaintiff side. It's probably the biggest regret I've got in the work that I've done in my life. So for me, this is just a joy to actually improve my karma. Okay, so Candor is a toolkit. It's full of tools as well. It's very, very compatible and supplementary and complementary to the stuff that Mary Ellen just presented to you. It really is a really great fit there, but it comes out of kind of a different domain. All the tools are at this website, Candor. It was published in 2016, and there are some really, really great tools here, and I think you'll see how they fit with Mary Ellen's presentation. It's kind of a tortured acronym, but it's communication and optimal resolution is what Candor stands for. So let's go to the next slide. So this was developed, the Candor idea started developing at the University of Illinois in Chicago. And the University of Illinois is a big healthcare system. It has a big healthcare system. It's got the biggest medical school in the country, but it's also a state agency. And the early motivation for this is they were spending millions of dollars on medically indefensible cases, defending cases where there was a clear breach in the standard of care, and but their lawyers were telling them they were legally defensible. And we know what that means. That means going after the patients and families and trying to find just weaknesses, using the process, using the systems to try to intimidate or exhaust or financially bankrupt the families who are forced to litigate for 6 or 7 years before they see any compensation or any answers, frankly. So that was the early motivation. The Board of Trustees at some point in time at this hospital system said, why are we spending so much on defending these cases? And especially, we often defend them and we often lose. And there's got to be a better way. And there were a couple of leaders in the organization, Tim McDonald and Dave Mayer, who were the really sort of ethical, principle-driven doctors who were saying, why aren't we defending cases that we know in our hearts are not medically defensible? We caused this harm. While this was developing, while the change was being implemented there, Barack Obama was our senator. And so there was dialogue back and forth with Barack Obama about this work we were doing. When he became president, he funded research to expand this work. We'd already had some experience in Illinois in doing it. He funded a demonstration project in Illinois where we went to 10 other hospitals, including for-profit hospitals, non-for-profit hospitals, large teaching centers, community hospitals, to see if we could replicate it. And then there were other projects in other states that were funded as well. And they all rolled up, in learning from all those demonstration projects rolled up into the Candor Toolkit. I also want to say this. So this was happening in the context of discussion about disclosure. We were beginning to talk about that, or probably, several years into talking about it. And there was a major publication that had come out that was really influencing the field. It came out of Harvard. Michelle Mello was the researcher. She now says that this is the one paper she wishes she had never written. But basically, she said if we were going to fund all of the harm that's caused in healthcare, it would be a financial Armageddon for the healthcare system. And that was just the context in which this courageous work at University of Illinois was doing, because they had made a commitment that they were going to compensate and offer remedies, put remedies on the table proactively for harm when they knew that they had caused it. That was the genesis of Candor. So we now know that the financial Armageddon thing hadn't happened, but it was in the context of the environment at the time. Can we go to the next slide? So what our work has shown us over time is that we're stuck in this paradigm, and it's really a paradigm that is driven by the legal system continually. Mary Ellen gave a great example of it, of just, you can't get lawyers often even when you know you've suffered preventable harm. The system is really expensive. The best estimates show that somewhere between 2/3 and 3/4 of the total dollars spent go to the transaction cost, with only 1/4 going to the patient or family as a remedy or as a restoration of some sort. The rest are spent in legal fees, expert witness fees, all of the fees that go into fighting about this and turning it into an adversarial process. So the knee-jerk reaction we're trying to get past as culture change is deny and defend being the norm, to an approach that really emphasizes the importance of quick communication, fair and honest communication when there's been inappropriate medical care, and the support for clinicians that I think Mary Ellen's presentation also spoke to so eloquently. There's all of this talk about burnout in the healthcare system, a lot of concern there. People talk about bullying, they talk about long work hours, they talk about just a lot of the stresses. I don't think they're paying enough attention to shame and to trauma as something that really eats at people. You go to work and you're involved in some kind of a event that just shouldn't have happened in your hospital, and you go home and you have to kind of choke that down and move forward in your life. And I think that shame and that guilt is often unresolved for a lot of our healthcare workers. Okay, so that's the Candor approach. And of course, there's a huge emphasis on learning too. So how do we learn from the events that harm people so that in fact we can improve our systems and make sure that future patients don't suffer the same injuries that really spread learning. Okay, next slide, please. I want to say that this discussion has been going on for a number of years. The man in this picture is Brock Nelson. He was the CEO of Children's Hospitals. He hired Julie Morath there when she was a young person. So those of you who know her, he gave her one of her entry-level jobs in really getting a chance to do safety and quality. And his moment of truth was when he was coached by his lawyers to go into a situation with a family where his job was to disinform them, to sort of deflect their suspicions or their concerns that there might have been preventable harm. He could not sleep. He went to his board of directors and said, "Fire me tomorrow, because I can't ever do that again. I can't live with myself." And his board of directors rose up and said, "You know what? You're the kind of CEO we want. We want to be a hospital that is known for telling the truth." This was 20 years ago in Minneapolis. They won the first John Eisenberg Award for this work. And we're still talking about this 20 years later. I'm getting increasingly impatient, frankly, about how we've had these anecdotal examples of hospitals that do the right thing, but it's still not, the deny and defend is still the norm in our system. We've got to change that. I wanted to give you this motivational piece, and this was very, very concurrent with the Wall of Silence book that came out from Rosemary Gibson, and that's honestly what we've got now. That the curtain falls, the silence falls, and the norm is, okay, this is a potential litigant now, so we're going to circle our wagons or pull back from communication at just the time when patients and families, and frankly providers, need it most for all the reasons that Mary Ellen just walked us through. Next slide, please. So the paradigm shift, to break it down a little bit, that is really at the core of what Candor is now trying to accomplish, is reporting. You can't move quickly into communication with patients and families unless you have a good reporting system. And right now, for fear, for shame, for lots of reasons, most reporting systems in hospitals are not as good as they could be. Communication with patients and families, we're really trying to make sure that in all the work we do with Candor, there's a complete commitment to transparency and honesty. Patients, deserve to know what happened to them, And the communication, as we all know, because we talk about it in this tribe a lot, is it's not a one-time, one-off thing. It's got to be ongoing. So changing that thinking from disclosure being a one-time conversation or a one-time event to really understanding that it's a communication process is important. Event analysis. We're learning a lot about how we actually help people who are suffering from shame or who live in cultures of fear, where they don't want to be blamed, or they are afraid of throwing a colleague who they think is a really competent, good colleague who might have made a mistake under the bus. So they just go silent, and we don't get the best facts out of our RCAs when people are unwilling to talk. So it's support for the caregiver, not just emotional support, but support for them to actually even remember and feel comfortable in their cultures with telling the truth. Feeding everything we learn into quality improvement. So if it happened in one unit in the hospital, or if it happened in one hospital or happened in one system, how do we get that spread to all the other units in the hospital, all the other hospitals, and all the other systems? Financial resolution. I mean, the biggest, I think, still surprising piece of this is part of Candor demands that you agree to put financial compensation as part of maybe other remedies as well on the table proactively without the patient or family having to litigate or claim or do anything. You offer it, and that is something that's been, I think, completely counterintuitive and completely disruptive to the typical ways in which lawyers and insurance companies think. Care for the caregivers. Mariana, you walked you through this. You cannot make this work unless you've got a way to really take care of the feelings and support the people that you're asking to have really heart-rending conversations with patients and families. And then patient-family engagement. Patient-family engagement, this is the best example I've got in my work of patient-family engagement really making a difference at the design level of a model, and we're going to walk through that next. I'm looking at time, Lisa. I'm going to move through this as quickly as I can. So once they made that commitment, they were going to be honest and put compensation on the table when their RCA showed that there'd been inappropriate care. This is the model that they came up with in Chicago, and it was called the 7 pillars. 7 pillars in Candor are essentially the same. 7 pillars is what we called it at the time. So I'm going to walk you through this diagram quickly. Up in the upper right-hand corner, when there's an unexpected event, we need it to be reported. We then do an evaluation about whether there was patient harm. If so, we look at the providers involved, see if they were also traumatized or harmed by it, start the investigation, hold the bill. So this was sort of risk management, innovative practice, best practice at the time that this was starting to be invented, which was the early 2000s. If our analysis shows that there was inappropriate care, we were going to do a full disclosure, put remedies on the table, and an apology. And we weren't going to apologize earlier because we didn't want to water down the power of apology being meaningful. And another kind of vector in the mix at this time were consultants who were saying, just tell patients you're sorry if they've had an unexpected event because that's what they want to hear. That's what the literature shows. We were concerned that that was watering down the power of the apology, not just for the patient or family, but also for the provider, making it almost, a risk management strategy to apologize as opposed to a heartfelt apology of accountability. We built patients and families into the mix here. It actually came through CAPS. The University of Illinois reached out to us, and we helped them bring some patient voices into this. And they looked at this model, and it was Carol Himmelgarn, for those of you who know her, who said, you know what, communication is way too late here. Because that disclosure opportunity is going to be weeks or months at best after something happened. And every hour that goes by that someone's not talking to me is another harm. And those harms are intentional. You might have injured my loved one or me unintentionally, but when you're not communicating with me, that's an intentional harm. And it was like one of those goosebump moments when that came forward from Carol's mouth. She's actually in a video in the Candor Toolkit talking about the number of years, months, and days before she had a real conversation with anybody about what had happened to her daughter. So Mariana, I got goosebumps when you were talking about the same experience that you had with James. Okay, next slide, please. So here was the revised model after Carol and other people weighed in. The University of Illinois made a commitment to be in communication with patients and families that had had an unexpected harm event within an hour after the event happened. And for us, that was significant because you don't know whether there was an error often at that point in time. Sometimes it's clear, but sometimes it's not. So it shifted us, this program, from being a program about disclosing medical errors to one about communicating with patients and families who've experienced harm. And to do that, you have to have a support system in place 24/7 for the providers that you're going to ask to be going in and starting these conversations with patients or families. So we implemented this 24/7, basically consult service from people in the organization who stepped up to volunteer, coordinated by the Patient Safety Office. And in order to make this work, we had to have the buy-in of the entire organization. So looking backwards now, when we, after hundreds of hospitals have implemented Candor and looking at our successes and our failures, we've often seen hospitals go into this or systems go into this with the good intentions of a few, but they don't have their liability insurance on board, they don't have their lawyers on board, they don't have a section of their medical staff on board, and it collapses and fails. You have to have complete organizational commitment here. And so the first step of Candor right now is a really thorough assessment process where you bring every audience in your organization in, from transporters and frontline workers and behind the scenes workers to the top of the organization, to explain what you're going to do and make sure that you have a complete cultural commitment to it. Very important. Okay, so this is the current Candor toolkit. There's basically training programs in each of these domains, how to identify a Candor event, so that's your reporting system and how it activates the system, how to communicate with patients or families, and our core training there, that it was a word you didn't mention, Mary Ellen, but it's the core of what we're doing, is empathy. So we really built on the literature and the tools around empathy to actually get providers to feel vulnerable and go into conversation with patients or families from a feeling point of view. We actually say, go in with your feelings. Don't worry so much about what you're going to say. Listen, understand where the family is. This is your opportunity to get to know them. You're not going to be able to fix what just happened to them, especially in that first conversation. Your role here is to tell the truth. With what you know, promise to tell what you don't know when you find it out, and just connect emotionally by finding something in yourself that connects to what they're feeling. Not that you understand their point of view, but you let yourself feel what it would be like to be in their situation. So there's a training module about event analysis too, and empathy plays a huge factor there too. The kind of work we're building on is cognitive interviewing, if that term means something to you. That's used often in law enforcement to help witnesses remember, but you go into a conversation with a real understanding for the providers and what they must have been going through at the moment, and try to get them to remember as many details as they can, and you get much, much better reports back that feed your RCA process. And then resolution, and this is honestly the simple part. If we did it, we apologize, we put remedies on the table, we started a discussion. And that's the training. Okay, next slide, please. I know we're running out of time. I'd love to leave some time for discussion. So we've now implemented this in actually closer to 400 hospitals because it's moving really, really fast, as certain systems in our country are implementing it and seeing the benefits. What they're finding is caregiver buy-in, because there was a huge need for that support system for people to help them communicate with patients and families when something's gone wrong. It was often lodged in employee assistance programs. What we found works best is honestly peer-to-peer support. Is there somebody else I can talk to who's had a conversation with a family as intense as the one I'm going to have, who I can get a little coaching for before I go in and have that first conversation, or the second, or the third, or the fourth? Here's what we're finding from those 200 hospitals, now more like 400. That article was only published a year ago, by the way. But disclosure policies are often used in a cherry-picking way. We disclose sometimes, but not consistently. We don't routinely bring patients and families into it. Very little attention being paid to health equity. And then the point that I made earlier, that unless you have your whole organization supporting this, it's going to fail. Next slide, please. This is the map of Candor implementation. You see a lot of purple over there in the west. That was Dignity Health, was a system that completely embraced this, that did training throughout their hospital. They were California-based, but they had hospitals in Arizona. it actually created a market. If you were doing this, and Dignity found a lot of success in finding patients and families that they retained a relationship with when they were open and honest about this. They did not experience financial Armageddon because they were saving so much in attorney's fees by settling things out really quickly. I should say that they don't do this without patients and families being represented with their own attorneys at the resolution process. So it is not something where we're doing quick settlements without appropriate representation. It's there. And then what also happened in California is about 3 years ago, the largest medical malpractice insurance company in the state, called Beta Healthcare, had been looking at the data, looking at the claims costs going down, looking at the reports they were getting from doctors and nurses who were saying, I need this training. I want this training. I want to be able to better communicate with patients and families. I want to be a part of my organization's learning from error. And so they started giving premium discounts to physicians, both in hospital-based settings and in ambulatory settings, if they would go through the training and commit to putting resolution on the table when standard of care medically was indefensible. Let's go forward to the next slide. This is where we are now. There's been at least one hospital or one system in each of these states that are at some stage of candor implementation. And it's been pretty dramatic. I mean, I spend a lot of time on the road now just kind of orienting people to, with talks like this, about benefits that often seem a little bit counterintuitive to them. That if you're open and honest, you actually retain your patients and families more often than not. You can't guarantee that, but more often you have respected them. You have not harmed them further. They stay with you as your customers, and your staff feels better, and your liability costs don't grow. Next slide. Oh, an inspirational quote. So this is the heart of our empathy training. It is about being vulnerable. It's about going in and really connecting. And for some reason, this gets, I think, kind of discouraged by a lot of the training that providers go through. If you're feeling too much, you may not be professional. I mean, we really give people permission in our trainings to feel very vulnerable. We throw very, very difficult communication cases at them and ask them to practice going in and talking to a family that has just experienced devastating harm, and just throw everything we can in terms of what you should expect. Unfair questions from families that blame one another for harm, questions for families who are financially devastated, even if they're, and what are you going to do with those questions when you get them? Often people don't know all of the services that their hospital can offer or their community can offer that families really need, and suddenly they're the ones having these conversations right away, and they've got to be more aware, not just of their own role in the organization, but their organization's role overall, and their organization's role in the community. So it's been vulnerability the key to making this work, accepting that you're going to be vulnerable. You're going to feel terrible when you have to go in and have some of these conversations, but it's healing it's potentially healing for not only the patient or family to be respected, but also for you to know that you were completely honest and vulnerable when you went into these conversations. Okay, 3 minutes left. I'm sorry, Lisa. I think we should do another session of this sometime to really get questions, because there's got to be a ton of questions that people want to know more about this. But for now, I'm done.
We will figure something out for sure, because we're getting some really good questions in the chat box that I just reviewed. Thank you very much, Marty. You have done a great job explaining candor. Let me just throw one question to you that was asked. How do you keep providers and organizations, and whoops, I just lost it. How do you keep providers and organizations
accountable?
Where is it?
Was it you honest?
Yes.
Honest question?
Yes.
There's work that the danger here is that it will be used selectively and not comprehensively, and that this will be turned into a risk management program just like those early apology things were. So there's a really cool project happening out of University of Washington. Tom Gallagher is heading it. There's several patient advocates that are core to the team at the design level to develop metrics right now that will help an organization evaluate whether they are authentically implementing this. And what's nice is it's being funded by a family foundation, by Beth Daly Allens Foundation, if you know that patient advocate, but she's supporting this, and those metrics are actually pretty far along. I think we'll have a product there that by like May or June of this year to share.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to that. Okay, well, I would like to do more questions, but I'm sorry, don't have time. Content is so important. We do have a webinar coming up about speaking up, speaking of questions, on February 20th with Kelly Smith from MedStar. And this webinar that you just heard that you'll want to share with your colleagues is going to be up on our website as soon as we can turn the recording around and provide an executive summary. And that is www.patientsafety.org. We encourage you to also explore joining CAPS if you're not a member, so you'll get information about the webinars and other great work that CAPS is doing. We appreciate your support and look forward to seeing you on future webinars and events. And a special thank you to Mary Ellen Mannix for the time she took to share about restorative practice, and Marty Hatley for sharing about communication and optimal resolution, the Candor Project. We hope that everyone can find the resources to implement these, and I can see I have work to do here in the Intermountain West to advocate for uptake on Candor. So I'm going to pursue that. Please drop us a line if you have further questions, and we will find a time to chat about this more later. Thank you so much. Have a good day.